Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can be slowly starting. My name is Jakub Nowakowski, and as the director of the Galicia Jewish Museum, this is my honor and privilege to start this project, to welcome all of you, but also all of our speakers and partners. We're grateful for you to be joining the last today's program devoted to the issue of memory. The program is a part of the larger project devoted to the Aktion Reinhard, 80 years after the industrial killing of European Jewry, and the project was marking the 80th anniversary from that horrible operation. And today we are to talk about the memory. What do we remember? How do we remember, and who remembers? And we have a very special guest today, speakers, Professor James Young, Professor Omer Bartov, and activist and Olympic sportsman Dariusz Poplela. And now I will switch to Polish for a second. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo serdecznie witamy podczas ostatniego panelu poświęconego 80. rocznicy operacji Reinhard. Całe spotkanie będzie prowadzone w języku angielskim. Dla tych z Państwa, którzy chcieliby skorzystać z tłumaczenia, bardzo proszę o odszukanie na dole ekranu ikonki globusa, kliknięcie na tą ikonkę i wybranie PL Polish. To pozwoli Państwu przełączyć się na kanał, na którym nasz tłumacz, pan Adam Musiał, będzie tłumaczył wszystko, co będą mówili uczestnicy. Ladies and gentlemen, before I will pass this virtual floor to Dr. Edyta Gawron, who will be leading today's discussion, I'd like to take one moment of your time to express my thanks to the partners with whom we've organized all 4 events. Tali Nates from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, and Marine Shahar from the Ghetto Fighters House. Tali, Marine, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to be working on this program with you and your colleagues. And together over those all 4 events, we've discussed some of the most important aspects of the Aktion Reinhard. With Professor Michael Berenbaum, we've talked about the road to the final solution. With Chris Webb and with Tali Nates, we've discussed the mass killings of 1942 and 1943 and the killing centers. With Professor Caroline Study Collins and Dr. Tamir Hart, with Jaron Zur, we've discussed the Treblinka, the resistance in Treblinka. And today, together with Professor Young, with Dariusz Poplela and Professor Bartov, we will be talking about the memory. And again, translation, tłumaczenie dla Państwa, którzy nie rozumieją po angielsku, jest dostępne. Proszę kliknąć na ikonę globusa i wybrać język polski. The questions, please write your questions in the chat folder. If there is only a time at the end, we will be delighted to take some of those questions. And last but not least, the event is recorded, so the recording will be available at the YouTube channel of the Galicia Jewish Museum, where you already can see the recordings of the previous parts of the program. So that seems to be all on my end, and now I would like to pass the floor and introduce my colleague, Dr. Edyta Gawron, a scholar, researcher, curator, and author and editor of numerous publications and articles. And that includes a very fresh publication, The History of the Jews of Krakow, that was published just 3-4 weeks ago. Thank you, Edyta, for joining us today and for agreeing to moderate this program. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to the event today, to the panel discussion. It's really my pleasure and honor to lead this final meeting of the series as described previously. The last part of it is devoted to the issue of remembering, remembrance, commemoration. What do we remember? How do we remember? Who remembers? These are the questions that we'll try to answer, and we have 3 speakers during this panel. We'll allow each of the speakers to have short presentation introducing the projects they've been involved in, and then we'll have the discussion. We'll invite also the audience to take part in the discussion at the end. The first person to speak is Professor James Young. I would like to ask Professor Young to talk about some of his projects, and his presentation will, initial presentation will describe the first memorials at Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, among others. Then we'll hear Professor Omer Bartov talking about his experience and his research on Buchach. And last but not least, Dariusz Poplela will talk about the most contemporary project, People Not Numbers, and his leading role in this project. So that's the plan for today. To start our presentations, I would like to say a few words about Professor Young, who is a distinguished university professor of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. The list of accomplishments is enormous, so let me just briefly mention some of them. He taught at several universities, including New York University, Harvard, Princeton, and University of Washington. He's the author of numerous books, including the recent one, The Stages of Memory, Reflections on Memorial Art, Loss, and the Spaces in Between. He's also the consultant and expert invited to work on several memorials, including Memorial to Europe's Martyred Jews, and also the consultant during the Jewry work on National 9/11 Memorial in New York. I could list the number of periodicals that Professor Young has written, some articles and op-eds and many texts, and also the list of awards. It's really impressive. But we are all looking forward to the presentation and to sharing the wisdom and experience. So let me finish right now. And Professor Young, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me, Tali, Medine, and Jakub for organizing, Edita for moderating the panel. So I've taken the invitation quite literally to look at the very first memorial sites. And of course, these very first memorial sites were the sites of destruction. Specifically, even while the war was still raging, memorials were created in places like Buchenwald and Majdanek, even Stutthof in Poland. And so I wanted to go back and look at what and how they were remembering at the very premise, and probably in discussion we'll figure out, in fact, how memory has evolved at each of these sites. What's remembered now is very different from what was remembered, for example, at Majdanek 35 years ago, 40 years ago on my first visit there. And that was even different from how the Red Army created the very first memorial museum there in October 1944, just 3 months after its liberation, in July 1944. So that was one of the very first, probably the first so-called Holocaust or concentration camp memorial established. So, of course, the very first memorials established in the case of Buchenwald was, in fact, by the prisoners themselves. I'm going to share an image here with you. Sorry about the quality, but this was literally taken, I think, by American liberating soldiers of a memorial that was built by survivors at Buchenwald in April 1945, within a few days of their liberation by American soldiers. It's an obelisk, you see, it's made out of wood, and it's hard to see in this image, but the letters KLB for Konzentrationslager Buchenwald are there. And so obviously this was prisoners remembering their own, and they did it in this very traditional form made out of wood, which they scavenged from barracks and built themselves, both to remember their own and to remember themselves in some ways as survivors of Buchenwald. So there was actually a memorial built here also by Horst Hoheisel, which I was trying to bring up here, to remember this memorial. It's called a memorial to a memorial, the Warm Memorial. And on the 50th anniversary of Buchenwald's liberation, Volkart Kniga, the director at the Buchenwald Museum and Memorial, invited Horst Hoheisel to commemorate this this destroyed memorial that you see on the screen here. And for whatever reason, that one's not coming up. So it's a slab of concrete heated to 37.5 Celsius, 98.6 Fahrenheit, to approximate the human temperature. So it stays snow-free during the winter, and when people often kneel to touch it. And it's just to remember that the memorial is commemorating something built by human hands, by the prisoners' hands themselves. So a memorial to a memorial. And maybe before we're done, I'll find that image for you too. So we're going to now go to Majdanek. And again, I guess the very first Holocaust Memorial Museum, in fact, was established by the Soviets in October 1944. On their way in, they had liberated Majdanek, the concentration camp, just a little bit before that July. And here, pardon me for being a little bit literal-minded, but I'm going to read exactly read you exactly what the captions were at the time, because they're very specific. And if we're going to ask that question, who remembers and how do they remember and what they remember, I'm going to literally read to you the guidebook that explains what is being remembered here, and I'm going to read to you what it said on the walls at the time. So these photographs are from 1980. That was my first visit to Majdanek. And these were already kind of an evolved exhibition. It wasn't exactly what was installed there in 1944, but it was close enough because it was still very much a Soviet interpretation. And by Soviet interpretation, I'm going to read you exactly what they said. So in the words of the guidebook, the aim of the memorial at Majdanek that you're looking at here is threefold: to preserve the buildings as material evidence of the crimes committed here, to analyze the facts of these crimes, and to present and analyze facts to the public. But it also becomes clear the ruins here are really being used as material evidence for the curated facts as remembered here at Majdanek. And so here at Majdanek, the objects really tell the story of the camp's Soviet liberators, configured in a pretty reflexively Marxist interpretation of the war and its victims. And one of the results is that the Jewish victims of Majdanek are kind of assimilated twice over, once to the memory of Polish national suffering, and again to a stridently economic critique of the camp, blind to the ethnic identity of the victims, At Majdanek, about 4/5 of the 350,000 murdered victims were Jews, but they're mostly Jews are recalled here as parts of other persecuted groups, including the Poles, communists, and Soviet POWs. So as we enter this very first barrack here, and we have some actual Polish translators who can even be more refined, but we've got something called Hitlerism in the years 1933 to 1942. And we read here in the exhibition that, quote, with the help of German industrialists, on January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the German Reich. The coming into power of the fascists marked the beginning of a period of brutal and ruthless dictatorship. The arson of the Reichstag served as an excuse for granting the government extraordinary plenipotentiaries and for endowing Hitler with unlimited power. Mass persecution of communists, socialists, and Jews followed. And in those days, and to this day, you see Polish teachers bringing their school children to Majdanek. These photographs are part of the exhibition that the kids will see. And then, of course, this exhibit on extermination at Majdanek, you've got the empty cans of Cyclone V, and you've got this kind of the striped uniforms of the prisoners. And then, of course, you have only the red triangle signifying the political prisoners. So, in this little arrangement, you've got, basically 4/5 of the victims at Majdanek murdered as Jews, being represented as, murdered as political victims here. So it wasn't a matter of really ignoring Jewish identity so much as conflating it with Polish and even Red Army identity in many cases here. And again, I would like to read exactly what they say in the guidebook. The Jews and citizens of various states considered to be of Jewish descent constituted the next largest group after Poles. Poles constituted the most numerous group, and almost all of them were political prisoners. Literally true. Jews happen to constitute the largest group of Poles there, though. They were put into the camp for racial reasons. A large proportion of the camp population was represented by citizens of the Soviet Union, many of whom were war prisoners. And so, quite literally, this is all true, but they're all of the prisoners are being remembered in the sign of political prisoners in the red triangle here. And we can come back and put this slide up, and we can have it translated by our Polish hosts here. So the ash carted out of the crematoria at Majdanek were collected in kind of a very traditional kind of Eastern Orthodox urn. And in some other images, I'll show you the Victor Tolkien statue, as well. So this is all regarded as evidence of the crimes here, but evidence for what? And early on, the crimes were described as you've just heard, but these have evolved over time. And what you find there now, I understand, is very, very different. But you see the exhibition is basically punctuated by the red triangles. Now at Auschwitz, also, huge expanse here, Birkenau, and here at Auschwitz I. I'm going to, and at Auschwitz in particular, we get kind of the evolution of memory is much clearer. But again, the relics would really seem to tell a story. The barracks are intact. These are shaving brushes saved here, piles of hair, the guard towers, the barbed wire fences. The fences were restored. Some of the guard towers were kind of restored afterwards. And in 1957, the Auschwitz Committee launched a gigantic international competition for a memorial to be placed at the very end of the railroad tracks at Birkenau. This was the winning design, but when it was mounted, it was regarded by Polish authorities, when it was mounted in 1967, when it was finally installed, as referring to specifically to, as you see here, human forms, tall, medium, and short ones. And the only short ones would be children, and clearly at Auschwitz, it was Jewish children and Sinti and Roma children being murdered there. And so down came these figures of the families, and up went a block of granite with a single triangle in the very middle of it. And again, what is being remembered here in 1967, really when Poland was in the midst of its own kind of anti-Jewish purges, that 4 million people suffered and died here at the hands of the Nazi murderers between the years 1940 and 1945. And of course, historians have always known, including historians based in Poland at Auschwitz, that around 1.1 to 1.2 million maximum people were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau, about probably 90% of them Jews, the others Soviet POWs, Sinti and Roma, and Polish political prisoners. This was changed so that even when you've got facts, so-called facts, carved into the stone, in 1989, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, and Tadek Mazowiecki, the new prime minister, he invited me and Michael Berenbaum and a handful of others to form an Auschwitz council to revise the historical facts here. And so they did. And they began by taking away those inscriptions, making them blank for a while. So you might just call this, memory in transition. But the blown up gas chambers, the crosses put up with Jewish stars by local Polish youth groups, and of course the very first visit by a West German chancellor to Poland after the war is explicitly explained here in the New York Times on November 15th, 1989, just a few days after the fall of the wall. Kohl ends trip to Poland with a visit to Auschwitz. Kohl recalls Auschwitz and, as a consequence, agrees to aid Poles in their conversion, to the West. And this is the huge memorial figure by Victor Tolkien, which was established or dedicated September 1st, 1969, on the 30th anniversary of the German Nazi invasion of Poland. And through it, again, the focus is primarily on that crematorium gas chamber complex, right through there, the so-called Valley of Death. And once again, the shoes, the clothes, the hats are all basically used here to provide evidence of what they might call economic plunder. They function as exhibition storerooms, but basically material evidence of the economic theft and plundering of victims by German Nazi industrialists, according to explanatory notes inside. And of course, Treblinka, this memorial by an artist, an architect, Polish artist, Polish architect, dedicated in 1964 to commemorate the some 800,000 Jews murdered here. The names carved in are Städte, towns of Polish Jewish shtetls. And what is remembered here is never again, nie wieder, in several languages. What is to be repeated, not to be repeated here, of course, ends up being surmised by visitors to the camp. Janusz Korczak is the only individual here, head of the Jewish orphanage in Warsaw, who went with his charges to Treblinka rather than being separated from them. and visited often. So, we'll recall that right now, the memory kind of constructed and created at all of these sites depends completely on who visits them, under what circumstances, who leads the tours. And these memories and meanings continue to evolve over time. And I think maybe that'll be our point of discussion as we jump off into that. So thank you very much for letting me share a few of these images, and look forward to hearing Omer and Dariusz. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Professor Young, for this presentation of the early memorials. And we'll definitely get back to some ideas you shared. Now is the time for a short presentation by Professor Omer Bartov, who is Professor of Brown University, Samuel Pisser Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the Department of History, and also the Faculty Fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. The author of numerous publications, numerous books. Again, I will just mention a few apologies for that. Starting with the Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past. I couldn't skip this one, being hosted by Galicia Jewish Museum. Voices, the other one, Voices on War and Genocide, 3 accounts of the world wars in a Galician town. And the book that I'm sure you will have some references to today, Anatomy of the Genocide, the Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach. Of course, I could talk more about the publications, research projects, editorial boards that Professor Bartov is participating in, but I think we are all looking forward to the presentation and to the talk about post-war commemoration in Buchach, how commemorative practices have changed, and how the memory laws in Ukraine, Poland, and Israel have evolved recently. So, Professor Bartov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining this panel. Thank you for inviting me to it. I said initially that I wouldn't share a PowerPoint, but I changed my mind, so I will be sharing PowerPoint, and it's coming up. And hopefully you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to try and do 2 things, and I'll probably run out of time, so I'll do the best I can. So as some of you know, I wrote a fair amount about Buchach, which is my mother's hometown. This little girl there is my mother. My mother's family on both sides, her paternal and maternal grandparents came, parents and grandparents came from this area. Most of those people that you see in the picture, if they did not die before World War I, were murdered in the Holocaust. And so the people who came to Palestine, which were my mother and her 2 brothers and her parents, were basically all that survived from my own family in Buchach, and not only Buchach, but in the surrounding area. So this made me interested in this town. This was one reason that I chose to write on a microhistory of Buchach. I also was interested in the place because it was the hometown, as a number of you would know, of Shmuel Yosef Agnon, formerly known as Chachkes, who was born and raised in Buchach, left it as a 21-year-old man and went to Palestine, to Jaffa in 1908, and wrote a great deal of his writing was about Buchach, and the book that was just mentioned, thank you for mentioning it, Tales from the Borderlands, has a great deal also of his writings and descriptions of Buchach, both stories, myths, and legends. This town Buchach, for those of you who don't know, is now in West Ukraine. So if you look to the left of this image, south from Lviv, a bit to the east would be Buchach. In the interwar period, it was in Poland, in the southeastern bit of Poland, which was a majority Ukrainian area with a large Polish minority and a very large Jewish population. And before that, it was in East Galicia within the Austrian Empire. And that's just an image of this town before the war. There's various interesting aspects to this, but I won't go into all of that. And a lively scene in this town, in the interwar town. It was occupied by the Germans who came also with their families to this bucolic place, had a pretty good time there, and murdered the entire Jewish population in the region, 60,000 people. It is still somewhat of a tourist attraction in Ukraine today, mostly thanks to its city hall, which was built in the 18th century. And in Tales from the Borderlands, I tell a number of stories about who created it and why Agnon had his own mythology about the origins of this Rococo 18th century structure. The murder of the Jews in the town occurred mostly in two places. About half of the population was deported to Belzec and murdered there, and the other half, over half of the population, over 5,000, were murdered either on the Fedor Hill, Fedir Hill, in this area, or in the area of the Jewish cemetery. So right after the war, the few survivors, there were about 8,000 Jews in Buchach before the war, but about 10,000 Jews ultimately were murdered either in Buchach or deported from Buchach because people were taken from elsewhere, from other communities, concentrated there, and then either murdered in situ or deported. In this picture, there are about 60 people, and they actually erected a memorial on the Fedor Hill, where the largest amount of the largest mass graves were located. But this memorial disappeared shortly thereafter. We only have a couple of images of it. And it likely was removed by the Soviets, who did not like ethno-specific memorials after the war, and removed a large number of them. So when I came there, there was nothing. I came there for the first time in 2003. The Fedor Hill had been planted by a forest, and one had to wander very deep into the forest to find a single memorial, which actually commemorated only the first killing of the so-called intelligentsia, about 450 members of the white-collar profession by the Germans in August of 1941. This area is filled with mass graves. They were unmarked then, and they're still unmarked today. So you can identify them, especially in summer, but it's very hard to find them, and it's not as easy to identify them. There is a big memorial there, but that memorial is to the freedom fighters of Ukraine, largely to the OUN, UPA, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, commemorating really the struggle against what they saw as the reoccupation of Ukraine by the Red Army in 1944, an insurgency that continued well into the late 1940s, cost tens of thousands of lives. And obviously, these commemorative efforts were made after Ukrainian independence in 1991. In between, obviously, one could not commemorate those freedom fighters who were considered by the Soviets to be pro-fascist elements. The other killing site, the Jewish cemetery, until very recently, looked more or less like this. It has been, in the last few years, it has been surrounded by a wall. By an initiative, a co-Israeli-American initiative, So a wall is being built around it for most of the post-war decades. It was abandoned and often used also to dump trash from the city in this area. You can see the intimacy of the killing there if you consider that this is one hill in which the killing occurred, and the hill behind is the Federal Hill, and the town is in the middle. One memorial was built in the area of the cemetery a few years ago. The last time I was there, however, it was very hard to approach because there was very thick vegetation around it, and it was said to have been broken by local hooligans. I have no information on it having been repaired. Again, this was an initiative, an outside initiative. Other memorials were built in the town. So apart from the memorial for the OUN-UPA on Federal Hill, there's another memorial for Stepan Bandera, who was the leader of the more radical faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Now, things that were changing in Buchach on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a bust of Shmuel Yosef Agnon, the writer I mentioned, has been put up in Buchach on initiative of a young woman from Buchach, and a center, a sort of literary center, was created. You can see another bust here of Agnon, and a literary center for readings it was created in the street that was renamed Vulitsa Agnona. So there were efforts, I won't go into all the details of that, but part of the effort also included a connection between this literary center, to which some Ukrainian writers were invited to remember Agnon and the kind of Buchach that he described, particularly in his famous 1939 novel, A Guest for the Night, which describes his own visit to the city in 1930. So part of that was also a collaboration with the Agnon House in Jerusalem. Obviously, because of the war, right now, this is not occurring anymore, but it was a very hopeful sign of a recognition of the city, of the town, of its own rich Jewish and, of course, Polish past, which had largely been forgotten for many decades after the war. This does not include, however, commemoration of the Holocaust itself or any memorials initiated by the municipality. Now, I want to take you quickly to what part of this did to me as a historian coming to these places and thinking about how does the local population of a town such as Buchach think, and not only Buchach, but many towns in West Ukraine, which was heavily populated by Jews. Over 10% of the population was Jewish, and at least half of the population of mid-sized towns in the area was Jewish. How did the local population interact with what was left of the people who had lived there, mostly in the form of synagogues and cemeteries? And in some soul searching, I started thinking about my own childhood. And that took me back to growing up in Ramat Aviv, which is north of this river, of the Yalkon River. So it's north of North Tel Aviv, just across. It's where the University of Tel Aviv is now. And I used to play in that area before the university was built, and it's because the university was created really the 1950s, but much more the 1960s and 70s. And there was a village there, and that village was called Al-Shahmuanis, and we knew it as Shahmunis. This is how we called it. When I was growing up, most of the population there were Moroccan Jews who had come there in the 1950s. We had a vague idea that it had been an Arab village, but nobody spoke about what it was. And this is more or less where this is located. This was a large village that reached all the way to the coast and to what later became Tel Aviv. There are detailed maps of it and photographs also that the British took during the British Mandate. When I played there, what we used to see were remnants of a Muslim cemetery there, and were remnants of a house that we call the Sheikh's house, now known as the Greenhouse. That village was basically occupied, and its population was evicted by Israeli forces in 1948. There is a long history of what happened there, which I won't belabor now. But this was part of a general expulsion of Palestinian populations from what became the state of Israel. So about 750,000 Palestinians were deported, evicted, or expelled or fled from the areas that became the state of Israel, and only about 150,000 remained there, many of them internally displaced, so not even in their own communities. So this area was occupied and gradually destroyed and became part of where the University of Tel Aviv is. None or almost none of the cemetery remains, whereas this house eventually was remodeled, the house that I used to play in, which was what we call the Sheikh's house, and became the so-called greenhouse, which has been used as the faculty club, where members of the faculty can have a nice, elegant lunches. So this is what I wanted to share with you as a presentation in the last 2 minutes that I have left, right? I have about 2 minutes, right? I'll just mention the second part, and hopefully we'll get to more of it. So what interests me really in this issue is what I call how memory is used as a tool of forgetting. And what I've tried to think through is the relationship between memory laws that have been passed in Ukraine, Poland, and Israel, and how they relate to each other. These are three countries that think of themselves, obviously rightly, as countries that have been heavily victimized, that have had terrible human losses, devastation, certainly in the 20th century. And if you think about particularly the Holodomor for Ukraine, if you think about Poland conceiving itself as the Christ of nations, as a country that paid the huge price in World War II, and if you think of Israel as seeing itself really as the inheritor of the Holocaust, as the carrier of the memory of the Holocaust, then you have three countries that see themselves as paramount examples of victimhood, and yet the victimhood of one is often in competition with the other. So I don't have time any longer to talk about this, but if we examine memories of memory laws passed in Ukraine, particularly regarding honoring the Ukrainian heroes of their own UPA, if we examine Polish memory laws that make it an offense to deny that what their own UPA did in East Poland was genocide, and if we examine Israeli memory laws that make any commemoration of the Nakba, that is, of the expulsion of Palestinians, and especially mourning the expulsion of the Palestinians on what in Israel is considered to be Independence Day, then we can see a kind of cycle of memory where remembering one event, that is one's own victimhood, necessitates erasing or marginalizing or negating the memory of the victimhood of others, particularly those who are connected in one way or another to one's own history. And I'll be happy to say much more about it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omer. Thank you for introducing this fascinating topic on Buchach, but going far beyond Buchach in this comments on memory law and the situation in Israel. We'll definitely get back to it in the discussion. But in the meantime, we'll also hear another story after hearing the expert on the early memorials and their evolution, and having this expert family account as well on Buchach. Now I would like to invite you to listen to an activist, a sportsman, and sort of outsider in the field of commemoration who became insider, Dariusz Poplela, who is an Olympian, a 10-time Polish kayaking champion and 2-time vice European champion in kayaking. And he is widely known in Poland as a sportsman, as an Olympian, but recently his parallel life as an activist is even more known and recognized. He created the project, which is called People Not Numbers. The project which has the goal to individually commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, to give the names to the people who were only considered as numbers for the time of the Holocaust, and very often also afterwards. Dariusz has managed to successfully honor the victims of several towns in the south of Poland, in the towns of Krościenko, Grybów, Czarny Dunajec, Nowy Targ, and recently in Nowy Sącz. All of that happened within few years with the group of volunteers and activists from these towns and the region. And we are talking about honoring of thousands of people with their individual names and bringing back their individual stories. Dariusz will talk more about his experience in this commemoration. The floor is yours, Dariusz.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor. And to make a long story short, I will just start my presentation. And I think the history of the project People Not Numbers, and it's also my private story, and I think it will show also what we remember, how we remember, because maybe later in the discussion there will be some question, because when I start my project, I didn't knew anything about the reason why I started my project was that I didn't knew anything about the Holocaust of my hometown, in fact, of Nowy Sącz, Jewish citizens, and this was the way to establish the project People Not Numbers. So I will just share the screen, just 1 second, and shortly I will try to start presentation. Okay. So yeah, so basically, like Edyta said, I am an athlete, a Polish sportsman, and this is also part of this story, because the reason why I have eagle on my chest and I use the white and red colors during the races, during the starts, championships, it's a part of my history, part of my story, because to represent Poland for me is something more than just to wear a jacket and to get the medals. At some point for me was to be the part of the Polish team, that I need to find answer about the history of Poland. Of course, not completely story, but that was my goal, to realize what you are representing. This was very important, and the part of this story was that I discovered the Jewish story in the story of of my hometown. And then I established the project, People Not Numbers. And as you can see, each color, it's a color of different city. Each year we made one project in one town. As you can see, it's already 5 places where we act. And talking about memory, I think this short movie, it's also some kind of answer about how we remember and what we remember. Because in fact, I am more let's say practical, yeah, and usually this is the level when our project start. This is the cemetery. This is the Jewish cemetery, and few years ago it looks like this. And I always compare the situation on the cemetery with the level of knowledge of local population. If the cemetery is completely neglected, for me this is information that the knowledge in the local community generally is very poor. And as you can see at these pictures, before it's a place where nearly 120 people are buried in the 2 mass graves. And as you can see before, it was the middle. It was completely forgotten place. Yeah. During our project, we have no time to explain everything, but we cooperate with the Rabbinic Commission. They made special research, and we find out the mass graves at this cemetery. And at each cemetery where we act, we discover the mass graves that were, like on this picture on the top, completely neglected, completely forgotten. Just to show you how it was before and after, and this is what we are in fact doing at each cemetery, because also the project is my answer with the knowledge about the Holocaust, with the knowledge that I find out about this huge tragedy. And this is all the time, the project is also my answer, my personal answer to this huge tragedy. And that's why I find out that because the cemeteries are neglected, are forgotten, we need to bring back the memory to the local population about this place. And through this place, we can bring back the memory about the Jewish community in the local population these days. Yeah. And each project at the cemetery, we finish with the monument and with what is very important, what I will show you later, with the name and surname at the monument, with the all victims from the village or town. It depends where we act. And my idea was, because I was 20 few years old when I discovered I knew about Auschwitz, I knew about the ghetto uprising, about Jewish tragedy, about the Holocaust, but I didn't knew what happened in my hometown. I didn't knew what happened in my district, my region. Yeah, and when I discovered this whole story, my answer was how it's possible that we don't want to remember, or we forget about them. Because when I discovered the old story, I tried to Google at my phone where is the monument in my city where I can light a candle or pray for these all victims. And for me, sadly, there wasn't such a monument, such a commemoration place, and for me it was big shock. And till that time, since that moment, I have so many emotion in myself that I need to act, and that's how I discover that to make a project successful, we need to engage the local community. We need to engage local important person like priest, like mayor, like the leaders of the local communities, because in Poland these days, in fact, we are talking about the memory about the Holocaust victims without Jews, because in these areas, in the small villages, there are no Jews anymore, and on the shoulder of the Christian community or non-Jewish community, it's the memory, in fact, and that's why we invite people, yeah, like Rabbi Shudrik, like German consul from Krakow, and we try to bring back the people and to bring back the memory about Jewish community, but also about the places, about the cemetery. Like in Grybów, for example, yeah, there was nearly 500 people suddenly. And the picture and the movie that that I show you before was exactly from this cemetery, completely neglected. And then during the commemoration, it was 500 people with us. What is also very important for me is a present of the descendant of the Jewish families. Sometimes in the small village, it's 1, 2 families, not more. For example, in Krościenko, just 5 people survived Holocaust. Yeah, so this is also important point, to find out the descendant, to invite them to our ceremony, and to cry with them, spend time with them, to pray together, and to read the name and surname of the victims. This is very, very important. This is exactly what I am telling about, the name and surname. Part of our project is, of course, meeting with the youth in the schools, in each town, each village. We invite local schools to our project. Sometimes there are 2, 3 schools, sometimes even 4. It depends from the place. Or like in Nowy Sącz, during the commemoration, there was 13 schools from our city. So I try to involve the youth to the project, because before I had no clue about the Holocaust. So I share with them not the historical fact. I am also sharing with them my story, the story, in fact, of some kind of discover, yeah, for me, because in fact it was like this. I discovered this big tragedy. We are usually visiting Belzec extermination camp, because this is the place where the Jews from my area, from the Małopolska region, were murdered, nearly 450,000 of people, yeah. And this is very important place, because people from the city where we act, from the villages, suddenly they discover that at the monument there is a name of their city, of their village, but in their city, their village, there is no memory. And this is also first step to take a part in our project. Of course, during our project, we are trying to use local media, local television or radio, to bring back the stories about the local community, about the local Jewish community, and that's why we publish their stories, publish their photos. Of course, these are hours and hours that our volunteers spend in the archives, yeah, to bring back this knowledge, because the families are still there, they are still in the archives, and this is what we are trying to do. We want to display their story, share their story with the local community. This is example of the 2 plaques from Czarny Dunajec, 500 victims, yeah, with the name, surname, and the age, because this is my answer for the Holocaust. They are not anymore some kind of stereotypical Jews or numbers. They are people with the name and surname, and sometimes, where it's possible, also with the age. And people can identify with the name, with surname, with age. And this is very important. During our project, we discover a lot of signs of the Jewish community, like matzevot, that they were stolen from the cemetery sometimes after the war, and made by Christian neighbors, for example, or non-Jewish neighbors. Yeah, and we are bringing them back. Sometimes we restore them, renovate them, because sometimes, like in Czarny Dunajec or Krościenko, after the population of hundreds of Jews, just one single matzevot was at the cemetery. So this is also, I think, some kind of answer how we remember and what we remember. So we are trying to show the local community that these are the gravestones, their places at the cemetery. And this you can also see how transition is going on. I just want to one more time remind you that we cooperate with Rabbinic Commission. All works that we are doing are with them. And as you can see, the empty cemetery slowly is changing, but also the photos show the people around, because usually we start with 2-3 volunteers and we are finishing with 20-30 volunteers that they are ready to act whatever it takes and whenever it takes. So I'm just speaking about people who are very, very involved. And this is how the commemoration looks like, looks at the end. These are the examples of the restoration, renovation of matzevot, also the story of Tali Nates, that she is with us today, the matzevot of her family member. We discovered at the one backyard in the city of Nowy Targ, and it was exactly like this. And then it was possible to renovate and to find out Tali in South Africa. That was also a big challenge and something unbelievable. But I'm always explaining to the youth that this story is not over. There is no dot at the end when we are speaking about the commemoration of the victims of Holocaust. And few examples how the cemetery change, or like in Nowy Sącz, the square where we built the monument to commemorate 12,000 victims with the name and surname. For me, it was very important to involve the local community. This is always the biggest challenge for me, to bring them to our to be the partner, to be a part of our project. And this is how it looks like now. We are completely social project. The monument in Nowy Sącz was created by private donation. Our big partner was the foundation Ledor Vador, and except of this donation, mostly was from the private money, so not governmental. We are trying to do all by ourselves. And people, not numbers. It's not only word identify with the victims, but also people create this project, volunteers, people who want to remember, who feel that this is something very, very important. In the short way, this is what we do and how we do. Of course, I have no time to explain you exactly all steps, but it was pleasure to speak about it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dariusz. It was really fascinating description of your work, and in a nutshell, showing all the aspects of it. And now we have time to discuss all what you have presented and go even beyond what was discussed with some additional questions. Before I ask the first question, I would like to encourage people in the audience to write your own questions in the chat. We have the first questions already. I'm sure you've been inspired by all three presentations, and we'll get back to the questions soon. So my first question, in fact, to all of you is about the evolution of memory in each of the cases you described. What are the stages of the evolution, how it evolved, what were the factors that changed the remembrance aspect, but also the memory of the Holocaust in each of the places, projects, or maybe one case that you would like to focus on. So let me start with James Young.
Yeah, I picked the case of Auschwitz-Birkenau just because it's maybe the most radical change came with the fall of the Iron Curtain, the turning of Poland from a communist state satellite, if you will, the Soviet Union, to the West, and in its turn to the West, they incorporated the understanding of the Holocaust in World War II, then from the West, in particular West Germany, Israel. And so one of the very first things they did was to ask the question of Auschwitz itself, at Auschwitz-Birkenau. What was being remembered there was completely historically untrue. The Soviets and the Communist Party in Poland at the time in 1967, quite literally inflated the total number of victims at Auschwitz in order to diminish proportionally the number of Jewish victims there. And it reflected an understandable version. By understandable, I don't mean sympathetic, but Poles understood that the Jews murdered during the Holocaust were murdered as both Poles and Jews, and that the identities were subsumed. And there was a weird, symmetry between Jewish and Polish victims. Of the 6 million Poles who died in World War II, about 3 million of those were Polish Jews, 3 million non-Jewish Poles. 6 million total Jews, nearly 6 million total Jews died, so that these kind of coincidental symmetrical numbers ended up reinforcing this understanding. And this is why I wanted to read the exact language to you, because they really understood that in 1947, the Polish parliament declared that the rest of the Auschwitz would be forever preserved as a memorial to the martyrdom of the Polish nation and other peoples. But it was really meant to remember the martyrdom of the Jews as a kind of Gehenna, so that when the Auschwitz was actually dedicated, Janusz Wieczorek gave kind of a consummate expression to the then contemporary Polish understanding of Auschwitz when he said, "Distinguished guests, here at the graveyard of Europe, at this necropolis of human hopes and inconceivable drama, one should keep silent. But to keep silent also means to resign. Yet your presence today proves we have not given up. We are richer with the true facts discovered in the laboratories of scientists and statisticians examining the history of World War II, martyrology of states and nations condemned by Nazi Germany to political and biological extermination. Among those doomed, Jews and Poles rank in the first place." So there was complete, understanding that they kind of occupy Jews and Poles as Jews and Jews as Poles. We're completely conflated in this understanding. And then the way that they understood Auschwitz itself is really, really interesting. And this is, again, the Polish government explaining that these places, Oświęcim, Treblinka, Chełmno, Płaszów, Belzec, Sobibor, Łódź, Białystok, Warsaw Ghetto, these are all stages of extermination, stations of the cross of Polish Jews, and Jews treacherously brought from other countries in Europe. And then this statement tells you everything you need to know. We know nearly everything about their Gehenna, or cavalry. That is, we know everything about the Jewish cavalry, the misery of Poles. So they understood that the averted genocide of Poland and Polish non-Jews, which had been also planned, was now going to be remembered in the actualized genocide of Jews in Poland. And so that understanding has begun to evolve and continues to evolve. But the case at Auschwitz is most interesting because they took Mazowiecki appointed this panel literally to remake memory, now in the guise of a new government understanding of what actually happened there, including changing the numbers back to what they originally, what they actually were.
Yes, and that's interesting what you are saying, especially in the context of some of the manifestations of the right-wing activists claiming return Auschwitz to the Poles. Mm-hmm. It's like bringing the memory back of the Jews who were killed there. It's taking the memory of the Poles away from this place. It's certainly some competition of memory there. But I would like to move to Omer to my question about the evolution, how the memory evolved in case of Buchach or any other case that you would like to discuss in this context.
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, what Jane says is, of course, the cardinal point that the main change in all of Eastern Europe is the fall of the communist regimes, which changes the memory regime in those areas. But obviously the change is not only in the fact that you can now speak about what happened to the Jews differently. It's also that each of those countries, and somebody was asking about that on the chat, also in the Baltic countries, you can also talk about your own past differently. And that creates a new kind of competition. So in the area of Buchach, or West Ukraine really, but it happens in many other places. You can think about Latvia and Lithuania as interesting examples too. Those people who were considered by the communist regime to be the bad apples, those who had collaborated with the fascists, now re-emerge as national heroes. And you can see that in stone. You can see it actually being commemorated in books, in some figures return to politics. Now, those same, not all of them, many of those national heroes that are now being commemorated for having fought for independence, for national independence, for our people, have often been associated also with working with the Nazis to kill the Jews, or if not working with the Nazis, doing it on their own initiative. So that creates an entirely new kind of competition of memory. Now, if you add to that the fact that with the fall of communism and the emergence of the EU now as the most attractive association for East European countries, here the emergence of the Holocaust as an important historical event, which is recognized by Europe in 2000, in the year 2000, in an international conference in Stockholm, as an event to be commemorated and to be remembered, which we think was always that, but was not. It's something that happens decades after the event itself. One of the conditions for joining the EU for East European countries is to recognize the Shoah in their own land. And that creates all kinds of problems because obviously East European countries want to join the EU. It's a pretty attractive offer, but it creates problems with how do you contend with your own past. That very past, which the communists actually didn't want to talk about very much. So the kind of repression of memory under the communists brings back both the Holocaust and the collaboration in the killing of the Jews, and brings up all the national heroes. So that is one, I'd say, type of competition of memories that is appears at the late 80s, early 90s, and is still up for grabs today, and depends, as you know, in Poland and in other countries, depends to some extent on internal competition over which kind of regime we want. In the case of Israel, which I want to mention, and there were some questions about that, it's interesting because those who don't know, the Holocaust is not a major issue in Israeli politics of memory right after the Holocaust. It takes time for it to emerge, as it does in other countries. It's not immediately there. Survivors are there, obviously. Yad Vashem is created in the 1950s, but the Holocaust is the main kind of core of Israeli identity. It takes decades. And without getting into too many details, it's really after the War of 73, it's in the 70s and 80s. It also then becomes part of I'd say, of a major political tool for Israeli government. Now, the problem with that kind of centralization of the Holocaust in Israeli politics of identity is that along with that, there is a growing emergence of the story of the Palestinians. And there is a relationship between them. That is, Palestinian activists are also learning from Israeli commemorative practices. But that, of course, goes entirely against the grain of what the Jewish state is about and what 1948 was and must remain within Israeli politics of identity. That is, it is liberation, right? It's called actually in Hebrew, the War of Liberation. Liberated from whom, right? Because the Brits left. The war was not against the Brits. But for Israeli politics of identity, the Holocaust is a cardinal moment of beginning. It's the hour zero. Now, if you suddenly say, well, wait a minute, but in that war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled or were terrified to leave and to flee through a vast amount of violence, which has been documented very well by Israeli historians using Israeli documents, Israeli government and army documents. How do we square that circle? So here, the role of the Holocaust in Israel, as Israel being the moment of redemption, as the resurrection of Jews, as the moment of glory, of rebirth after the Holocaust, is marred by the fact that the state is created by turning the majority population into a minority, by evicting the majority so that there will be finally a Jewish majority state. That creates huge, I'd say, conflict within society, despite the fact that the historical facts are known and no longer disputed. Among historians, there's no dispute as to what actually occurred. It's only within political rhetoric, educational policies, and so forth. The final thing I'll say is that this is all connected to the relationship between Israel and many other countries, but particularly, and that is what interested me also because of my own work, Ukraine and Poland. So in 2006, some of you may remember, the then Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, came to Israel, visited Israel. And the sort of underlying logic of that visit was that Israel would recognize what had just been declared by Yushchenko, would recognize the Holodomor as genocide. Now, why did Yushchenko need Israel to recognize the Holodomor as genocide? Well, it had to do with the fact that Israel was seen, and in some ways he was right to think that way, as the most important country to put a stamp of approval on the Holodomor as genocide. And it would then take away the kind of accusation that was current and remained in white circles in Israel, that the Ukrainians collaborated en masse in the Holocaust. And so that in some ways, by recognizing the equivalent victimhood of Ukrainians in a Stalin-directed genocide, there would be now no longer this kind of competition between the two countries. Obviously, this didn't happen, and Israel did not recognize the Holodomor as genocide. Also, because for Israeli political needs, the Holocaust must remain outside of that discussion. It is not something like another genocide. It has to remain out of that. It has to be something that gives increasingly Israeli government's license to say we are above criticism. No country can criticize us for what we do because of what happened to us. This is very similar in the dispute that was between Israel and Poland, as you all remember, over whether we can speak about the fact that Poles, as again has been well documented in recent research, that Poles actually participated in killing Jews. That Poles could be both victims of German occupation and victimizers of Jews at the same time. That for Poland, within the general Polish discourse, is extremely difficult to accept because it undermines one's position as this country of victims. For Israelis to accept the fact that you cannot talk about it is equivalent to Palestinians accepting that you cannot talk about the Nakba. And to me, I'll just end with one example, because when Jan Tomasz Gross's book came out in 2000, he came to visit Israel. It was actually the first time I met him. We had a very nice meeting, and at the time he was interviewed by an Israeli newspaper. And the interesting thing was that in Poland, when the book came out, as we all know, it created a huge furore and so forth. Because how is it possible that Poles were killing Jews? It was the Germans who were doing it. When he was interviewed in Israel, the journalist said, "So what are you telling us, that Poles were killing Jews? We knew that all along. What is so new about your book?" So much of what we are talking about is how different communities have already created particular regimes of memory that are completely different from the other ones. And while they can be reading the same history, the preconceptions come from a completely different place. And that changes over time, but you have to understand that the preconceptions are quite different from one country to another.
Yes, sure. Thank you for this thoughts on the victimhood, using victimhood as the political tool, but also being selective in mentioning the active role, both as the resistance and as the oppressor in this case. I'm curious what Dariusz wants to tell us about the evolving memory, and we'll get back to some ideas that you shared already.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to show you one more picture, and I think I will again try to show you the local evolution, which I think will confirm what the professors were telling about, because this is the just I will share my screen. This is the picture plaque that was originally put on the side of the mass grave where nearly approximately 500 to 800 Jews were murdered in Nowy Targ. And just imagine that, I think it was, I'm not sure, but it was one of the first commemoration after Holocaust, because the date when this plaque was set up at the mass grave site, it's the 30th of August 1945. And it was made by the Jew who survived the Holocaust, Mr. Hertz, 20 years old, and just imagine that after few weeks later, Mr. Hertz was murdered by the neighbors, because it was after liberation. There was not any more Germans over there. And this Ludwig Hertz, he was the, let's say, this 20 years old man, was a chief of the local Jewish community of survivors. He was murdered, and just imagine at the invitation there was his name and surname. They sent invitation to the Krakow Jewish community that the commemoration will took place, but this is the tragic things. He was murdered just after few weeks later, and the Jew escaped from this area, from Nowy Targ, from Podhale district, because the Jews were murdered by group of partisans and also by some neighbors. Yeah, so this is exactly what you were talking about before. And then the communism start. There is nothing going on at this cemetery. Just some volunteers try to do something, but in 80s just to clean or something like this. When the communism collapsed, there is a first commemoration made by Jews from Israel, the survivors, the family of the survivors, and another 20 years later, there is our commemoration. Yeah, so this is something what Professor said before. This is at the local ground. This is something like this, and when we speak with the local community, there is always this competition. Yeah, there is always, but in my opinion, also I didn't knew anything about the Holocaust before. Yeah, so these local communities very often they even don't realize how many Jews were murdered in the cities or villages, and that's the biggest problem, because when they realize the many stereotypes are destroyed, because in some places they still believe that Jew will come back and they will restore their properties. And then I explain them it's impossible, because in your city survive, for example, 3-4 Jewish people. Yeah, so this is the level that we are talking about. Some people say now it changed a lot. From one point of view, yes, but from the other, the biggest issue is indifference. People just don't care. They have no clue, like you said, like Mr. Professor said before about the victims from Auschwitz death camp. Yeah, there are still people that they are discussing with me that the Poles were the biggest number of victims. I don't want to lose my time to discuss such a thing. So I just saying visit the official website and check, because there is exactly everything. Yeah, but this is the level which I am trying to change in these local communities, because sometimes the story, like I told you before, that Ludwig Hertz was murdered by Poles, not by Germans, is a shock. They don't believe in it. Yeah. But also there is a group of people who remember. Of course, this group is year and year smaller. Yeah, the people are dying, the witnesses are dying, and they, of course, remember this sad stories, this tragic story. and very often they remember their friends, they are talking about them, but they still exist in the big groups of some Jews, of some numbers, yeah. And this is the problem. So at this local ground, you can see this what was going on at this. This was the example of Nowy Targ cemeteries, yeah, and you can see this on the monuments, how the history of commemoration was made there, yeah.
Dariusz, as you are speaking, I have two questions directly to you, which are kind of related to what you were saying, just saying. One is about, do you have any support, involvement or understanding of local inhabitants in your commemoration mission? So what is the reaction of local people?
Yeah, mostly the first reaction, because usually I go to the mayor or president of the city. So first is, Mr. Dariusz, maybe better don't do anything, because there will be a lot of troubles, a lot of problems. But I always try to explain to the mayor that he's in charge of the local population, and the Jews were part of this population. Because like Professor said, of course, there was during communism's time, there was no difference between that. There was just the victims, they were Poles, yeah, and it was generally how they called the victims, yeah, and for them, in many cases, they have no clue what happens in their cities or villages. So I'm trying to change this vision, and usually it works slowly, but it works. And sometimes when they are against, after 1 year of our project, they are part of our team, and this is very important. So with knowledge, we can change this, but slowly. It happens very slowly. So usually, no, in every commemoration that took place, we have our partners is local community. Otherwise, I don't know if the project will be finished. Yeah, so always we have a part of community, because I cannot say that we change the whole local community. No, of course, no. There are, of course, some groups that they are part of our projects, and I am happy that each time there are many surprises. You know, sometimes there are some youth, sometimes there are emerites, yeah, sometimes the people, some old people, young people, some people from religious group, punks group. So people from different worlds, yeah. But the idea of commemoration, when they realize the scale, and they usually the most important moment is when they see the list of the victims and they realize the scale. And this is something what also changed me and my perspective, and it usually works with the local community. Each place where we act, it's open non-stop. There are no one closed the cemetery or something, and till today nothing happened. So yeah, so I think without local community it will be different, but this is what we are trying to do, to bring them together, to act together. But this is the process, yeah, and I cannot say that we changed those places, but we are trying to do this, yeah.
Thank you. This is also part of my next question, which I'm afraid due to the time limit, I won't be able to ask. It's about the actors in the process of remembering, because we are talking also about who remembers and why people do not remember, and why people organically forget. And this is the whole issue of contradiction between remembering and forgetting, and forgetting being sometimes the state project or the state politics. But I would like to also give you a chance to reply to some of the questions in the chat before we close our discussion. I wonder, Omer, if you had a chance to look up the questions about your comments on Arabs in Israel and the settlements.
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly just say that in line very much with what Dariusz was just saying, you know, there's knowledge and there are opinions. And in fraught historical moments and referring to fraught moments in the past, they don't always work together. I started my career writing about the crimes of the German army on the Eastern Front. And, you know, my first book on that came out in '85. The second book came out in '91. And there was a big debate about that in the late 1990s in Germany. Is it possible the German soldiers took part in crimes on the Eastern Front, although everything had already been documented? So historians knew it, the documents showed it, but the public had a great difficulty accepting it. Not the Holocaust, but the involvement of the German army, because that really represented the German nation. And there is the same thing regarding Israel in 1948. There is a vast amount of documentation by Israeli authorities, by the Israeli state, by the Israeli military from 1947, 48, 49, both on the expulsion of Palestinians and, of course, on the utter refusal of Israel then to accept any of those refugees back, which has remained until today, and the destruction of their property, so that even if they were to somehow infiltrate back, they would not be able to live in their homes because over 400 villages were destroyed. But we have a number of participants who are disputing that. And, you know, what they can do is take, say, Benny Morris's vast study of the origins of the Palestinian question and read it. And that book came out 2 decades ago, and it's all there. But it's interesting in the sense that there are really different types of memory. There is historical memory, that is what historians write and document, and that can be disputed. That no book is definitive, but there are certain aspects of that that can be documented. We can still have people who deny the Holocaust. I'm constantly asked about that, but that has nothing to do with documentation. It's got to do with something else. So there's historical knowledge of the past, and then we have what people want to believe. And usually what people want to believe is not their own memory, but it's something that they internalize because of the politics of the place in which they live and because of the problems that are caused by changing that kind of memory, by looking up to the past. And to my mind, in countries like Ukraine, like Poland, and like Israel, one of the main problems is to look back at what in Poland people speak about as a difficult past. As long as you don't look into your difficult past, it's very hard to create a healthy future, because this will always come back to haunt you in one way or another. It's happening now in Poland, it's happening in Ukraine, and I'm afraid it may happen more. We don't know what will be at the end of that war, and it's right up for grabs in Israel now. We cannot understand what is happening right now in Israel without that inability to actually accept the past and come to terms with it. Germans have done it to a larger extent, in part because Germany was defeated and destroyed, and because the crimes it committed were so vast that they were really impossible to deny. But that's a really important process that many countries, including, of course, the United States today, are grappling with. How do you look back at your own difficult past and come to terms with it?
Thank you so much. This is such an important message. I'm almost tempted to close the meeting right now with your message about the understanding and working on the past in order to build a greater future. There are a few questions left. I hope we can answer in a chat. Dariusz, there's one question for you, if you can quickly answer in the chat. But I have a very quick question for Professor James Young to close the meeting. You were the advisor to several projects of commemorating the past. what would be your advice for commemorating, remembrance of the Holocaust in the places we discussed? Is there any universal message that you would like to pass?
I'm not sure if it's a universal message, but as Omer just suggested, every country needs to come to terms with its own past in its own way. When just before joining a jury for Germany's memorial to Europe's murdered Jews, the Denkmal in Berlin, I explained that they were paralyzed because they were trying to do something that nobody had ever done before. How to rebuild Germany and reunite Germany on the bedrock memory of its crimes. It's never been done before. And I used the example, where in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall is there even one pebble to remember the slave auctions, which were held right there for 100 years? Washington, the United States, has not built its memorial culture, its memorial legacy on the memory of America's, if you will, original sin of slavery. 250 years of it here is nowhere acknowledged, on the National Mall. And the only response to that must be, look at what the Germans have done. They have found a way with great difficulty and great contention to remember, that the mass murder of Jews by the Germans is very much a part of German history and European history, and that they, in fact, have built a very strong democracy on that memory, as unlikely as that may seem. And Clint Smith, an American writer for the Atlantic magazine, is suggesting that, in fact, Americans have much to learn from German Holocaust memorials and Holocaust memory, as we now seek to make central to American history and memory the enslavement of millions and millions of Africans on these shores, and their mass murder and over in the Middle Passage. And we need to build contemporary American history and culture, on this, huge missing piece. So how does every nation do that? How will Poland do it? How will Ukraine do it? How will Israel do it? Israel's struggling. Where is the Nakba? How can Israel's great war of independence be regarded as the greatest catastrophe of all time by Palestinians who were dislocated? And it's built into Israeli history. Israel struggles with it. They've got a great generation of historians which are confronting it, but it's a huge struggle. So that, insofar as every country has to struggle with how to commemorate terrible crimes committed in the national name, we're each going to have to do it in our own ways, but we can look to the examples that are out there in Poland, in Germany, in this country. Israel's doing it as best it can, but it's a struggle for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comment. We definitely have to educate. We need to do research. We need to think about the past, understand the past. Without that, there is no future, peaceful future. And we see that in our times today. We have to deal with the past first if we want to build the greater future. So I think with that conclusion, unfortunately, I have to close the meeting. We've been exceeding the time given by the organizers, but the discussion was so interesting and so vital that it was really a pity to close it down. Thank you so much. Thank you, the organizer, but most important today, the three panelists, wonderful panelists, Professor James Young, Professor Omer Bartov, and Professor in Spe, Dariusz Poplela. You're doing a great job. I've learned a lot. I'm sure people in the audience have learned a lot and are inspired. And we look forward to the next opportunity to have the discussion together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
It was pleasure, and thank you very much.
I hope to see you soon in Poland, maybe in April.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.